There is a phrase we use back in the country. It says, "Be without food, but don't be without shelter or home." Shelter is very important than food. I was working as much as you can work, like 3 jobs. Even with all of those efforts, I couldn't afford to even get a little bit time with the kids.
At the age of 16, I entered the American foster care system. I've pulled myself out of some pretty bad spots, but I needed housing, and what I was making was just not cutting it at the time.
How can a family grow and prosper if they don't have a home that they can afford in a decent neighborhood?
In the past several years, the situation has become more urgent than we've seen even 10 years ago. It has implications for people's lives.
There are so many American families that don't have enough income to afford rental housing. Half of the renters in this country are paying more than 30% of their income for housing.
The low-income housing tax credit allows investors to invest money in housing and get credits, and the result is funds to build additional low-income housing.
The Section 8 vouchers are the primary way to help people afford housing.
Vouchers are a way for a resident to get into an apartment that costs more than what they can afford with their 30% of budget allocated to housing.
There definitely would have been a lot more detours, a lot more failures, a lot more uncertainty.
Now I know that I can enjoy the life, being with the kids, and have a brighter future.
First off, I think housing is a nonpartisan issue, but I certainly believe that the bipartisan approach to solving it is what needs to happen.
Every social goal that we want for the people of the United States revolve around housing. A precondition for making progress is to have a decent place to say, tonight I'm going home to rest.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center. My name is Dennis Shea, and I serve as an Executive Vice President here at BPC. This has been a momentous week in U.S. trade policy. With his April 2nd Liberation Day announcement, it is no exaggeration to say that President Trump is attempting to restructure global trade and birth a new international economic order. The President views the international trading system, the current one, as deeply unfair to the United States. In his view, it has led to massive and persistent U.S. trade deficits, the deindustrialization of the American heartland, and a significant diminution in U.S. national security. With his 10% global baseline tariff, which went into effect this past Saturday, and his discounted reciprocal tariffs on dozens of U.S. trading partners, which go into effect tomorrow, he is attempting to use access to the large consumer market as a source of leverage. The stated goals are to achieve more balanced trade, protect key U.S. industries, and build up U.S. manufacturing and productive capacity, combat unfair trading practices, including non-tariff barriers, and raise federal revenue. In response, some U.S. trading partners are seeking to strike deals with the Trump administration. Others, most notably China, have retaliated by raising tariffs on U.S. imports. The markets have not reacted kindly to recent events, but I am pleased to report that the S&P 500 is up more than 3% this morning. To shed light on these developments, we have brought together a great group of experts. Greta Peisch is a partner at Wiley Rein, a law firm with an excellent trade practice. Greta served as general counsel of the Office of U.S. Trade Representative from 2021 to 2024 during the Biden administration. Kellyanne Shaw, at the far left, is a partner at Hogan Lovells, another excellent law firm. Kellyanne served as Deputy Assistant to the President for International Economic Affairs during the first Trump administration. Rounding out our panel in the middle there is an economist, and that's Michael Strain, the Arthur F. Burns Scholar in Political Economy and Director of Economic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. And the moderator for today's discussion is none other than Anna Swanson, the intrepid trade reporter for the New York Times. So I want to thank all the panelists for contributing to what will be certainly an enlightening conversation. Before starting, let me remind our virtual audience that if you have questions for our guests, you can post them to our Twitter X account at BPC_bipartisan using the hashtag BPCLive. You may also submit your questions in the YouTube chat. And we will save time at the end of today's discussion to take questions from both our virtual and in-person audiences. So with that, Anna, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bravo.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for that great introduction, Dennis. Thank you for inviting me to be here today. We have a fabulous panel. I think it's probably been very interesting and a little strange for all of us to have trade and tariffs, these formerly very obscure topics, be on just everybody's lips around the country right now. But obviously, we're seeing very momentous changes in trade right now with a lot of significance for the economy and the world. So I'm excited to explore that today with these great panelists. So I'll just go ahead and dive in. I think we have a lot to talk about. So Kellyanne, I'd love to go to you first to talk a bit about what do you see as the significance of these tariffs that were announced last week, being put into effect both this weekend and today. What is the significance in your mind for the country, the economy, and where do we go from here? I'll start with an easy question for you.
Yeah. Well, I only have 52 minutes to answer this, so I'll do my best. No, and good morning. It's great, obviously, to share the stage in a panel with colleagues who I've worked with for years, and we've cared about these issues deeply for decades. Now, all of a sudden, my mom cares about it as well, so it's definitely an interesting time. So, it's hard to overstate the significance of what President Trump announced in the Rose Garden, these reciprocal tariffs along with the baseline tariff. So it's effectively two different types of tariff measures that were announced, so 10% for everybody, and then an additional supplemental amount for countries that are responsible for the largest portion of the U.S. trade deficit. And what was announced yesterday by Secretary Bessent, and again reiterated this morning, is that the administration is interested in negotiating some of these tariff rates down in exchange for tariff and non-tariff barrier concessions by other governments. So what was announced is the ceiling, and everything else will flow from there. So we may see a reduction in some of these tariffs. Or in the case of China, where countries retaliate, we'll actually see some of these tariff rates go up. And so the president has said that there's going to be another 50% tariff added to the already 54% tariff on Chinese goods starting this week. So we may actually see tariff rates at a minimum of 104% and all the way up to 130 some odd percent on Chinese imports, which, again, hard to overstate how significant it is. This is the largest single trade action in my lifetime. It will likely be the largest trade action in any of our lifetime. These are once-in-a-generation moves that the president is making to shake up the global trading system, and I don't think anybody really knows where this goes, to your second question.
Okay, great. Greta, do you think this is a negotiation? Who do you see as maybe in line for getting deals, and how much could those deals actually reduce the tariffs that we're seeing overall, or do you think that the tariff rates will still stay quite high?
Well, I think there's a lot of question around that. I don't know that I have all the answers. And what we see a bit is competing objectives and narratives about what the tariffs are supposed to do broadly. So we've heard, coming up to this announcement, we heard about raising tariff revenue, about reducing the trade deficit, about bringing manufacturing back, also about potential negotiations and addressing tariff and non-tariff barriers that our trading partners have. And so I think that one thing that we have really seen even in the last week is a bit of shifting back and forth between those objectives and what's going to flow exactly from these negotiations. Or from the tariffs, will it be negotiations with some countries? Will those negotiations be an option for every country? I think in the background, we've heard a lot about the tariffs, non-tariff barriers, but of course the tariff levels were set based on the trade deficit. And if the administration wants to move the needle on the trade deficit dramatically, that's quite hard to do, even if all tariff and non-tariff barriers are removed. So if that's the objective, I think there's a real question of, what will be the outcome of negotiations? How much will tariffs go down? I think these are all questions that we don't have all the answers to yet.
Mm-hmm. Michael, what are your thoughts on that? So what do you see as the goals? Is this a negotiation? Can trade deficits actually be reduced in the near term?
Well, I think the president is pursuing multiple goals, and those goals are in conflict with each other in many cases. And the president doesn't seem interested in resolving that conflict. And I don't quite know, how to process and analyze that because that's an unusual position for a president or a White House to be in. These tariffs cannot both be an instrument to reshape the international trading order, to reshape the composition of American industry away from services and toward manufacturing, to reshape the composition of U.S. employment away from services jobs to manufacturing jobs. It cannot be that and also be a tool to negotiate lower trade barriers. And I think the kind of fundamental reality to focus on is that the president is a mercantilist. He believes that bilateral trade deficits are a problem. He believes that bilateral trade deficits exist because the U.S. is being taken advantage of. The U.S. has entered into bad deals. Other nations are behaving unfairly. That is a deeply incorrect view of international commerce or commerce of any kind. I run an enormous trade deficit with my grocery store. I take lots of goods from the grocery store. I don't supply any goods to the grocery store. That's not because I have entered into a bad deal with the grocery store. It's not because I'm being taken advantage of by the grocery store. It's just the nature of what I produce and what the grocery store produces. The same is basically true with the U.S.'s trade deficits with allied nations. Maybe we set China aside, and so it's kind of unclear where this goes. But I think where it will not go, to answer your last question, is it will not result in the elimination of the U.S. trade deficit. It's not well understood, but trade policy actually has very little impact on trade deficits. And trade deficits are a function of big macroeconomic forces like the savings and investment behavior of households, businesses, and the government in the United States. If we want to close the trade deficit, we should be closing the federal budget deficit. We should be pursuing policies to substantially increase savings in the United States. Tariffs and trade wars are not going to do it.
Okay. Kellyanne, what do you think about those, conflicting goals that were mentioned? Which of them do you see as most important for the administration, given your sort of insight into the previous Trump administration as well?
Yeah, and I don't see them as conflicting. I think all these things can be true at the same time. And I do agree that the way the administration messages the problem it's trying to fix is multifaceted, right? So they talk about they want to onshore certain production. We've got national security challenges because we don't produce steel, aluminum, certain things that we need in times of conflict or military reasons. They want to fix the trade deficit. They want to level the playing field with trading partners. They want to use tariffs to collect revenue. Like, all of these are reasons that they will give. And I think they can all be true at the same time. So part of it is, and this does get to the point that he just raised about the trade deficit. And trade alone is not going to fix the trade deficit, right? Tariffs alone are not the solution. There have to be domestic measures. You have to look at FX and currency. You have to look at a bunch of different factors. But I do think that a large trade deficit is symptomatic of a potential unbalanced trading relationship. And that's the way that a lot of the administration officials are looking at this. But the administration is clearly interested in domestic production, in reindustrializing the United States, in onshoring critical and certain supply chains, and in leveling the playing field. So this is not an anti-trade policy. It's about making the U.S. an attractive production destination, which also includes selling into other markets, right? And so that's part of it as well. But like, anytime you have a large policy or any sort of measure that a government adopts, there's usually one or more objectives. There's not just one. I do think where there may be tension is this idea of using tariffs as a revenue source, right? That implies that they're going to be there for the long term. And then at some point you have fewer imports coming in because your tariffs are so high, so the revenue source goes down. I think the revenue point is more about messaging. It's really about the trade deficit. It's really about production. It's really about national security. And to the extent that more revenue is coming in, that's a good way to message it to the American people and to President Trump's base. But I don't think that's the primary objective of these tariffs. I think some of these other things are.
And if you want to jump in, and comment on each other's comments, please feel free. So Greta, it seemed like, with the Biden administration, there had been kind of a bipartisan consensus reached on, the fact that trade deficits could be problematic in some cases, that tariffs could be needed in some respects. Now the Trump administration seems to have pushed, beyond that consensus, perhaps. Talk to me a bit about that. Where do you see that?
Sure. I mean, and I think that that's getting lost a bit. I mean, Kellyanne and I would talk before the election, and we would often end up agreeing with each other quite a bit on the diagnosis of our trade challenges, namely China, supply chain vulnerabilities, and the need to stimulate manufacturing in the United States. And I would say that that's pretty non-controversial. And that's in part why you saw some continuity between the first Trump administration and the Biden administration. I think what's worrying, kind of stepping back around that, what was sort of a growing bipartisan consensus, is that the most recent actions by President Trump, raising the tariffs dramatically, causing a lot of concern about what the impact will be on the economy, is that some of that consensus could fall apart. And I've spent my career, and still do, working to defend U.S. companies, promote them, and if tariffs are a tool to do that, to combat unfair trade practices from China, to help protect those critical industries, steel, aluminum, but others that we need to maintain in order to have both a secure economic base as well as our national security base, but that could become have a stigma on it after the kind of arc of the tariff actions that we're on. So I think it's important to kind of continue to remember that there is that sort of consensus around some of these problems and issues, even if there is a growing divergence on what the solution is.
Has it put some Democrats in a difficult position who would have previously supported tariffs, and how are they walking that line, do you think?
Well, I think there's still, I think yes is the answer, and I think you see a variety of responses to the actions and struggling with how to maintain the narrative of yes, there is a role for trade policy. It's a part of a total government policy in addressing these problems that I mentioned, and also explain why you are concerned about the magnitude of the action and the sort of lack of strategic focus from the most recent actions. And so I think that does pose some challenges for Democrats to explain how they view trade policy and its role in the economy, because it just becomes so much more complicated. And if you need 2 paragraphs to explain something, I think you usually lost your audience.
I'd love to ask any of the panelists what you think the role for Congress is right now in these debates. Obviously we've seen some measures introduced in the Senate. I think you'll see another one today, actually, countering the tariffs. Could those really go anywhere politically?
I think those are 2 separate questions, and I will happily answer both.
That's great.
Look, I think we're here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, a bastion of civility. This conversation has been very civil, as is appropriate, but we shouldn't allow a civil tone to obscure the severity of this situation. The tariffs that President Trump announced and that are coming online are an emergency situation for the United States. These tariffs will not advance any of the goals that have been mentioned on this stage. These tariffs will reduce manufacturing employment. They will reduce the competitiveness of U.S. manufacturing firms. They will raise prices for consumers. They will increase unemployment. If they are not scaled back, they will likely cause a recession. They are an assault to the rule of law. The president has ripped up all the trade agreements that the United States has entered into, including trade agreements that he has signed. They are increasing geopolitical tension with our allies at a time when we have a land war in Europe and a land war in the Middle East and increasing tension in the Pacific. They are an assault on the U.S. constitutional system. The president's tariffs, as announced, are the largest tax increase in peacetime in modern history. They are the largest tax increase since the Revenue Act of 1968, which was used to fund the Vietnam War. It is not the president's job to raise taxes by hundreds of billions of dollars a year unilaterally with no legislation. I'm not a constitutional scholar. It may be that this is technically legal, but it is, and it may not be that it's technically legal. I don't have a view on that, but I am a citizen of the United States. I know how our government is supposed to work, and this is an egregious assault on our constitutional system of government. And so Congress absolutely should be stepping up and asserting itself. Congress should be asserting itself because of the damage this will cause to the economy. They should be asserting itself because of the damage this will cause geopolitically, and they should be asserting themselves because of the damage this does to our constitutional system. Will they? I am not optimistic about Congress stepping up anytime soon, but if the president doesn't scale back the magnitude of these trade barriers, then as economic damage accumulates and as his approval rating drops, that will create political space for Congress to step up. And I hope and expect that if enough damage accumulates, Congress will.
Do either of you want to respond to that? That was
I was gonna say, tell me how you really feel about these tariffs. I mean, look, I think that there are different perspectives. Obviously, that is one, and is one that is shared by a lot of our allies who do feel attacked by these tariffs. But what I would say is it depends on whether or not you buy into the national emergency that's outlined in that executive order and underlies this measure, whether you think these longstanding, persistent, and sustained trade deficits are really an emergency. And if you do buy into the fact that they are an emergency and an economic and a national security one that the U.S. has to take dramatic and drastic action to fix, I think you'll be more sympathetic to the actions the president took last week. And part of it, too, is I don't view it as an attack on the international legal system because I don't think the World Trade Organization is up to modern economic challenges. And I think every country is doing whatever it wants anyway. And empirically, you do have these asymmetric tariff rates between the United States that has much lower tariff rates than other governments and a bunch of non-tariff barriers that are unfair in terms of just the global trading system. The U.S. took steps to lower its trade barriers unilaterally over the last decade for a lot of different reasons, most of them linked to national security, to giving Europe and other countries economic development assistance after World War II, to the fact that we wanted to create this global trading system. And so we cut first in the hopes that other countries would follow. And that just didn't happen. And then we let China into the World Trade Organization, which exasperated the problem. And so again, you either buy into the fact that it's an emergency or you don't. And I think that will very much inform whether or not you think these measures were proportionate or even called for. But that said, this is it is a living measure, right? These tariff numbers are going to change over time, and frankly, some of them may change very, very quickly. So it's hard to sort of evaluate the effects of them in the short term, and what the administration is asking for is more grace in terms of many, many months to evaluate its policy. They're saying, don't look at the snapshot in time today. Don't look at the X trillions of dollars of loss in the markets from the last 3 days ago. Check in with us a few months from now and see where we are. And I don't know if the American people will give the administration that grace and that leash, but that's what they're asking for. Now, when it comes to Congress, I think Congress has effectively abdicated a lot of its constitutional authority over the last several decades. It's very clear they've let various administrations drive the trade policy, even though constitutionally, Article 1, Section 8, anyone who worked on the Hill knows that tariff policy is the Congress's. But through all of these delegated authorities, presidents have effectively been in the driver's seat. And I think that's still the case today. And part of it is the Trump administration has a very specific vision that House and most Senate Republicans have bought into in terms of where he wants to take the global trading system, where he wants to take U.S. trade policy. Now, if the political runway on that runs out, I do think that Congress certainly has the tools to take some of these votes and to strip away some of that authority, but we have not seen any indication that that's the case to date. There was a symbolic vote in the Senate the same day that Trump announced his reciprocal tariffs over the fentanyl tariffs, where a few Republicans did vote with Democrats, but it was never going to go anywhere anyway, just because of House rules. I don't see any sign that House Republicans are ready to break with the president. That could change, but as of today, I don't think that Congress is ready to jump back in that driver's seat.
Mm-hmm. There was a lot in there. Let's break it down a little bit. So, Greta, I want to ask you first about Congress. What are your thoughts on where that's headed?
Sure. I agree that it's very unlikely that there will be congressional action checking these tariffs. But at the same time, this is a massive undertaking. It's hard politically to sustain it. And so, the president has demonstrated that he can withstand that so far. But as members, raise concerns more frequently as the impacts, the market's one thing, but, does this have impact on their constituents, on businesses, on consumers, where they're seeing the effects to their bottom line? And that will lead to members having to raise their concerns more vocally because that's the system we're in. They have to be accountable and responsive to what their constituents are seeing. And so the question is, does the president respond to growing concerns that mount over time? And I think I see a interaction with that, with his strategy with partners, because if he wants to relieve some of the tariff burden, some of the stress on the system, that gives him more motivation to find an off-ramp. And that will lead to a different set of parameters for negotiations potentially. If he's looking for ways to alleviate some of the stress on the economy, he's going to be more open to negotiations. And so I'm going to be watching for, is there a feedback effect between the political sphere, the economic sphere, and the strategy that's being pursued and how quickly it's being pursued by the administration.
Okay, great. And the other theme I think that Kellyanne was touching on that seems to underpin some of the Trump administration thinking is about the global trading system, and that, you know, the WTO and the global trading system are already kind of broken. So what's the problem with coming up with this new regime, or that a new regime is needed? And so I wanted to go back to maybe Michael and Greta and see what you think about that idea. You know, does it matter at this point to throw out the global trading system and try to do something else?
The WTO clearly needs reform, but you know, there is a large leap from the observation that the WTO needs reform to the argument that the president can just throw the USMCA trade agreement, for example, in the trash can, even though he signed it. And we're discussing the latter, not the former.
Where do you think that leads us to when we have a situation where, you know, these systems that have underpinned trade are being thrown out? What does that mean for?
Where do I think it leads to that the trade agreements are being thrown out? I think it makes it very difficult for other nations to believe that any agreement that they enter into with the Trump administration will be honored. I think it makes it very difficult for U.S. businesses to have any idea what their costs of production will be while President Trump is in office. If a trade agreement that sets tariff rates on imports can just be unilaterally discarded, I think it makes it extremely difficult for exporters to the United States to have any idea how to make plans. And I think that level of uncertainty, which is what happens when you so aggressively turn your back on the rule of law, will have substantial economic implications for businesses, workers, and households.
And Greta, did you have any other thoughts on the WTO? So obviously, you know, dispute settlement has been frozen for a while. The WTO has not come up with new trade agreements, you know, been particularly active in that respect. On the other hand, I did see that Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala said that, you know, she made some comments saying that still maybe more than 80% of global trade operates under the WTO, but these measures will bring it down into the 70s, I think. I'm not quite sure about those numbers. So, I mean, most of global trade is still operating on WTO terms, right?
Sure. I think, you know, one of the bigger, obviously, I think there is, again, consensus around the idea that the WTO needs reform and that isn't really fit for purpose today. It was one of the problems is it was basically stuck in time, and that time, you know, the world has moved past. We've become much more globalized. China has risen. It's part of the WTO. And those rules and maybe also the tariff bindings aren't really appropriate for our industry, for the world economy, for how trade is flowing. But there wasn't really an avenue to negotiate that the Trump administration has felt, at least to date, would solve those problems. So that would be, you know, one avenue would be to work through the WTO to try to address and change the tariff agreement and change some of the parameters through that system. Now that's hard because it's a consensus system, and so I think there's a lot of questions about, well, how would the members move forward in that sense? I'd say that said, I think the WTO does and continue to serve an important role and can into the future. I think first it sort of serves as a baseline or backdrop of, you know, what are the rules that are considered to be, you know, apart from the tariffs, part of a fair trading system. How should those maybe change? But what's the sort of baseline that we're all starting from with common conversation? And then I think it can also serve as a forum that, you know, the United States can and has used to raise issues with China's practices, with practices of other countries, and to raise the profile and to try to convince other countries of their members that, we need to look at things differently. We're in a different world. We have different problems. And, even if some of those core functions, the negotiations, dispute settlement even, aren't as used by the United States. Maybe they are by other countries, but certainly there's a role for the United States to be there and drive the conversation and work as much as it can to find solutions in that venue.
A lot of these tariff measures are based on the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, declaring a national emergency. How robust do you think that will be to legal challenges? Do you think this could all be overturned in a court at some point soon? Any of them?
I could give a non-lawyer's answer.
Okay, and then you have some lawyers that can jump in.
It seems to me that arguing that a situation that has existed and persisted for 40 years has suddenly become an emergency, even though over that 40-year period, the United States has experienced broad-based prosperity, seems to me to be, kind of silly on its face. But, not a lawyer.
And what's the legal perspective?
Sure, happy to jump in. As a partner at a law firm, I'm a bit constrained in what I can say on the record in terms of it. But look, I spent 10 years in government, most of them in the executive branch, a creature of the executive. I tend to think the president has broad authority under a lot of these national security statutes to do things that he or she views as fit for solving that particular problem. I do think this will be litigated in courts come April 9th, as soon as there's an importation and somebody has standing to sue. I'm fully expecting a lawsuit. I think the administration is as well. But one thing I would observe, just in terms of the way this plays into even exceptions and negotiated outcomes with countries, is that if the president decides to negotiate deals with countries, which it sounds like he's going to officially launch negotiations with Japan, there is a bit of interplay between the legal basis of a measure and the type of deal that you can strike, and ensuring that whatever exceptions and exclusions you give, whether it's to reciprocal tariffs or to some of the 232 tariffs or any of the other measures they take, match the legal basis. Meaning, I see it less likely that we'll see the president take off tariffs for countries with whom we continue to have a large trade deficit and there's no path forward. For countries with whom there is a surplus, I see it more likely that we would be able to strike some of those deals because, again, the underlying legal basis of that measure is about the trade deficit. And so that kind of informs where policy direction might go with some of this.
Mm-hmm. I agree that there's certainly going to be challenges. There has been a challenge with respect to the China tariffs under the fentanyl order, and I expect those to continue. Unclear now how they're going to come out. There is the tradition of deference to the executive for national emergencies, foreign affairs. But also, this isn't the only tariff authority that there is. They're blowing off thick layers of dust from other authorities and looking at them from what we can tell. And so I think it is important for partners, for businesses, observers to sort of step back and not think that maybe litigation is the magic key to unlocking and changing this strategy, because I think the president's very committed to it. And if that tool is blunted, there may be others to use. I do agree with Kellyanne that there's pluses and minuses to different tariff authorities. IEPA is very fast and very flexible in that sense, but it may not be as flexible in sort of thinking about sectors or thinking about negotiated solutions. Maybe other tools are more effective. And I'm sure that the administration debated the pluses and minuses, but that's all to say that, this policy of the president, if he's committed to it, it wouldn't go away as a result even of that type of litigation.
Mm-hmm. One big question I have about this is, does, kind of this aggressive stance, or maybe some would call it bullying, actually work? So you've seen a lot of countries come running to the United States with significant concessions, the EU offering to drop tariffs to zero in return for the same on cars and industrial goods. So I'm curious, is that something that can net out positive results, or is the Trump administration kind of overestimating the power of the U.S. market? Is this something that is going to drive other countries to work around the United States, or maybe drive them, together or into the arms of China? Any thoughts?
I think it depends on what we mean by work. And so, this policy will not succeed at substantially increasing U.S. manufacturing employment. This policy is not necessary to increase U.S. manufacturing output, which is near an all-time high. This policy will not move the United States from the number 2 nation in the world in terms of manufacturing output to the number 1. So relatively speaking, we'll stay where we are. This policy will not succeed at reducing the overall U.S. trade deficit, which is driven by large domestic macroeconomic forces and not driven by trade policy. Will this policy succeed at getting some of our trading partners to reduce their tariff rates? That's certainly possible. But in the case of our allies, those tariff rates are already very low. I would love to see Canada go from an average tariff rate on U.S. exports from around 1.5% to 0. That would be great. That would not change the world, but it would be an improvement. I think the EU's tariff rate on average for U.S. exports is around 3%. It'd be great if that fell. But the damage that this will do, if sustained, to U.S. workers and businesses and households will far exceed the benefits of those quite modest reductions in trade barriers.
Well, how do you see this flowing through into the U.S. economy in terms of inflation and what it means for the U.S. consumer?
I think it's hard to say because we don't know what the policy will be, but the policies as announced would increase the U.S.'s average tariff rate to above where it was under the Smoot-Hawley tariff regime that is widely accepted as having made the Great Depression much worse than it otherwise would have been. I think economists every day are raising the probability that they assign to the U.S. entering recession at some point in the next year. My sense is that the policies the president announced would add around 1.5 percentage points to inflation. So the Fed wants underlying inflation to be at 2%. It's currently at about 3%. Under President Biden, it went up to about 6.5%. So this could bring underlying inflation up to 4.5%, which would be an enormous policy failure on the part of President Trump, and which would have severe economic and political consequences. Under President Biden, of course, high inflation was coupled with falling unemployment and left the unemployment rate near a record low. This policy would be accompanied by rising unemployment, which would make the situation even more severe. So this is a very, very, very destructive policy, and it is difficult to think of another example in American history of the government engaging in this degree of a self-own.
Greta, what are you hearing from how companies and chief executives are responding to this? Are they moving manufacturing back into the United States? Are they waiting, on their investments to see what will happen?
Well, I really do think a lot is frozen, right? We, day to day, hour by hour, sometimes it seems, you hear a bit of conflicting messages about where this is all going, where tariffs are going to land, and whether you're a U.S. manufacturer or have a presence in another country that could come back to the United States, it's just too early to know. And I think that if we had a sense of where are we going to be in 9 months? Where is this going to stabilize? Then companies would have more of a direction of what to do in the near term. But frankly, right now they're just trying to understand first what has happened, how does it impact their operations, how they move goods across borders, what may happen, who may retaliate. Will the policy change? Will the tariffs be paused? Will they, what's going to happen in the next day, week, month? And certainly not thinking about major changes operationally at this stage.
Okay. And I'll open it up for audience questions in just a minute. Kellyanne, one last question to you. We've talked a lot, obviously, about this last week's tariffs measures. What else is in the cards that's coming that we should know about? Any other tariff or trade measures that you've got your eye on?
Yeah, and this tees off sort of Greta's comments as well as Michael's as well. So tariffs are a component of the administration's economic plan, but there's also tax cuts, deregulation, cuts to government fiscal spending, energy diversity, and they will point to all of these things as part and parcel of their broader economic plan. When it comes to looking at client questions, I'm experiencing the same thing as Greta, where a lot of businesses are just sort of on the sideline, like want to see where this settles before making any decisions, because this is a living measure, right? Like it's changing daily in terms of the tariffs. But they're also going to be influenced by what happens in terms of domestic policy and what incentives there are to increase production, which I think is going to be incredibly important to whether or not the administration is able to pull some of this off or not. But in terms of like what else to expect, certainly additional 232s are coming down the pike. Administration effectively said so much in its executive order, waiting for one on pharmaceutical products, semiconductors. There may be other products that are critical for U.S. national security interests that we'll see investigations on. There were also 23 reports that were due to the president on April 1st, so the day before this big tariff announcement, related to all aspects of our trade and economic policies. So there could be announcements on currency manipulation that the Treasury Secretary will be running some sort of negotiation or policy on, inbound and outbound investment screening, potential updates to that. There might be tightening of some of these ICTS rules on autos that the Biden administration put out, and then a host of other types of measures that may be coming down the pike as well. And so this is our Super Bowl for trade lawyers, so a lot to do. I was telling Anna earlier, like I like take a break for a couple of hours, come back, and the world has changed. So that's where we are right now.
Great. All right, let's take a few audience questions. Raise your hand.
Do we have a mic? Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just identify yourself first.
Yeah, this is a terrific program. My name is Patrick Malloy. I was General Counsel of the Senate Banking Committee and Chief International Counsel of the Senate Banking Committee for 15 years. I'm a trade lawyer. I'm not an economist. I also was on the China Commission, which is a think tank for Congress on China and the national security implications. So let's come back to this formula for GDP, and this is at Michael, and then other people can comment on it. When you have a formula for GDP, there's a term called net exports. When you have negative net exports, it detracts from GDP and job growth. When you have positive net exports, it adds. Mm-hmm. China last year had $1 trillion positive net exports. We had a $1.2 trillion negative net exports on manufactured goods. Now, I think in the last 30 years, we probably had about $15 trillion worth of negative net exports. So the question I would ask is, doesn't this enormous and ongoing trade deficit have a very deleterious impact on jobs for Americans and on the position of the United States in the global economy? Mm-hmm. And I think, Michael, you're an economist, so you might want to take that on, but then I would love to hear what other people say. I think we got a huge problem.
Sure. So I think the answer is no. And the reason, you mentioned this now infamous formula. GDP is gross domestic product. It's designed to measure the amount of production that happens domestically in the United States. And the way that is calculated is by adding up consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. The reason we subtract imports from in that formula to calculate GDP is because a lot of consumption spending is consumption spending on imported goods.
Yeah.
So it's consumption spending on goods that are not produced here. And so that shows up in C when it shouldn't, and so we have to subtract M. The formula would be just as accurate if it were written as C minus M plus I plus G plus X. And I think articulating the formula that way it actually helps people to understand what is being calculated. So I agree, of course, that in national income and product accounting, we subtract imports from GDP, but that does not mean that imports are somehow making America poorer or are hurting job growth. If you look at the first Trump administration, let's say, we had extremely low unemployment. Everybody who wanted a job could find a job. And the trade deficit expanded dramatically during President Trump's first term in office.
So you don't think trade deficits have a deleterious impact on the American economy?
No.
Massive and ongoing.
I do not.
Warren Buffett says trade deficits are going to sell the country out from under us in his famous article in Fortune magazine.
Yeah, Warren Buffett is the Warren Buffett of investing, not the Warren Buffett of economics. And if Warren Buffett says that trade deficits hurt employment, he's not correct.
Do either of you want to weigh in on trade deficits and whether they're harmful?
Well, I'm not an economist, although I did take economics in college.
I'm not a lawyer. Hadn't stopped me.
But I do think this goes to some of the underlying rationale of the Trump administration, and the way they look at the world is more similar to the way you presented, right? Which is if you can take that $1.2 trillion trade deficit and cut it in half, or instead reverse it, so we're exporting more than we're importing, that's going to help with GDP growth. And that's part of the formula they weren't able to get to in the first administration. So this is very much part of the second administration, while also doing these other things that are going to help with the investment numbers and the other parts of that equation so that we don't lose there. This is a huge swing. They are breaking a lot of glass, and with the hopes of putting it back together in a way that ends up better off than where we started. But they've got to land a lot of planes to do that. And the president thinks he can, and we'll see if he's right or not. But this is part of the underlying rationale of the Trump administration's move. And that's why I said, too, you either buy this as a national emergency or you don't. Michael does not. I do. And so you might look at these same measures through different lenses, but that's where they're coming from.
Yeah, it is interesting to me that such a major policy is, based on something that we're still debating, is also very hard for people to discuss and understand, right? So it definitely needs more discussion. We have an online question, and then I'll go back to the room for another. Do you think this would motivate the WTO to fix its dispute settlement apparatus? Does this USTR care about actions the WTO could take to help right global trading systems?
I guess I could take a swing at that. So it's not the WTO, it's the members, right, who need to fix the dispute settlement apparatus. The WTO is really just the forum. It's a member-driven organization. And I think that's part of the problem is there just really are divergent views on dispute settlement and what its purpose is and how it should operate. And I had a lot of these conversations when I was in the administration with their trading partners because, again, the Biden administration had a lot of similarity in how they were thinking about this. So I don't see that moving forward until members can bridge that divide and come up with a new type of mechanism to not just litigate but to actually settle disputes, right? And then the question about does USTR care about actions the WTO would take to help right global trading systems? I think USTR, in the last administration, last Trump administration, USTR was engaged at the WTO and put proposals out there. And so again, I think this goes back to the WTO serving as a forum to put these issues out and say, well, this is how the United States thinks about it, and engage with the rest of the world, with members on these tough issues.
Okay, great. I think we had a question here in the back. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, I wanted to ask about sort of the political and negotiation aspects. I'm Chris Rugaber, reporter at Associated Press. I guess this would be more for the lawyers, but happy to hear from everyone. The Trump administration talks about having the cards with the size of the U.S. market and so forth. which certainly makes sense. But I'm wondering about the political aspects where, countries overseas cannot be seen as knuckling under to the U.S. And so how that plays out, I mean, you look at Canada where the Liberal Party was going to get defeated in the next election, and then Trump started picking on them, and now that's all been turned around. So how, in terms of negotiation, how does this play out where, whether it's Canada, Europe, or even China, the governments there can't really be seen as knuckling under, and then you have a president who likes to trumpet his victories. So, is that going to be an issue or a problem here? And how does that play out? Thank you.
I'm happy to jump in first. Yeah, so Greta and I are both former U.S. negotiators, so can offer our negotiator hat perspective to this. I mean, look, it's going to play different in every country, and I think the administration appreciates that the domestic politics in every country are different. So you look at President Sheinbaum, for example, who one could argue that she effectively gave in to the president's demands and met him where he was, but her approval ratings went up to 85%. The same set of facts played out very differently in Canada, right? Where you have like Canadians taking American products off the shelves and booing Americans at hockey games. So like different governments are going to respond in different ways. What has been interesting is that most governments so far have not actively retaliated. So Japan, for example, got the first deal, or they're negotiating the first deal, but they took a more conciliatory approach. They're able to spin that domestically as a win, as they successfully handled the Trump administration. And some governments will be able to do it that way and others won't. And I think from the Europeans, we're expecting mass retaliation and that to go unresolved for quite some time, in part because the European population is so spun up about this. But it really just depends country to country.
That's great. That's insightful. We have another good online question. Tariff revenues have historically made up a small portion of overall federal revenue, typically less than 5%. President Trump has suggested before that tariffs could replace the federal income tax. Can we do this? Why or why not? I feel like that might be one for Michael.
No, we cannot.
And why? Why is that?
Because the amount of revenue that tariffs would bring in would be a small fraction of the amount of revenue the federal income tax brings in.
Okay. All right. Short and sweet. Okay, we can take another one from the room.
Hi there. My name is Caitlin. I worked on trade communications and trade policy for 5 years at the U.S. Chamber, worked on USMCA quite a bit. Quick question for you guys. So I know there's been a lot of talk about how long the damage period is, or the bottoming out, or of some of the market effects and everything. But I wanted to ask you guys, when would American people start feeling prosperity if all of these things worked out? So like, in terms of bringing manufacturing back and setting that up, like what is the timeline for that? Because short term, I mean, it feels like it's going to be at least 5 years. So I just wanted to see if, there's a lot of talk about the damage and the pain and the short period of pain, but what is the timeline for prosperity if all of these things worked?
They will not work, and maybe to say more about it, about half of everything the U.S. imports are inputs to production by U.S. domestic manufacturers, and so for the half that are consumed by households, prices are going to go up and real income is going to go down. For the half that are brought in by U.S. manufacturers, their costs of production are going to go up. That's going to make them less competitive. That's going to put downward pressure on their ability to employ people, not upward pressure. If you look at President Trump's first term, the employment boosting effects of protection against import competition were dwarfed by the employment reducing effects from higher input costs for domestic manufacturers by something like 4 to 1. If you look at the employment reducing effects of retaliation from other nations, we lost about 3 times as many jobs from that as we gained from import protection. That is just the nature of international commerce when supply chains are as integrated across national borders as they are today. In the United States, for every 1 job in steel production, there are 80 jobs that use steel. And so President Trump's tariffs might help that 1 worker who produces steel, or that 1 company that produces steel, but they're going to hurt the 80 workers who use steel and the companies that employ those workers. it's not going to net out to a win for the American people. You are already seeing layoffs as a consequence of President Trump's policies. Cleveland-Cliffs, the steel manufacturer, just laid off 1,200 people. Stellantis just announced a big layoff. That's before these tariffs have even kicked in. So this is not gonna, it's not gonna happen. It takes 3 years to build a simple factory. It takes 10 years to build a complicated factory. The idea that we're gonna be in for a period of short-term pain, but by 2027 or 2028, it'll be, a manufacturing renaissance in time to allow Republicans to keep the White House, is completely delusional and has no empirical support whatsoever.
So let me just add on. I had a former colleague in the Trump administration who would say, Kellyanne, you and I are going to spend the rest of our careers on panels talking about this moment in history. And I think this is one of those, right? Like for the next 10 years, we're going to look back and evaluate whether or not this was a good idea or a bad idea. But here's what the administration would say. They would say, wait till Q4. And they have said that. So multiple surrogates have been on and they said Q1 is Biden's quarter, we're cleaning up the mess. Q2 is Biden's, Q3 maybe a little bit us, Q4 is Trump's. And that is the political timeline and the grace that they have asked in terms of an evaluation of these policies. And then we'll see, in 10 years from now, we'll get back together in this room and we'll talk about whether or not this worked.
Just quickly, Q1 has been great. And Q4 is gonna look a lot worse than Q1. We just had a great employment report for the economy in March, for example. If things are better in Q4, it's because this will have been walked back.
Well, I don't know that we need to wait 10 years to talk again. We could probably talk Q2, Q3, next week, tomorrow. Things will be different. So thank you so much to this fabulous panel, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Anna, for doing such a masterful job as a moderator, and thank you for our panelists for their divergent but always enlightening positions, and we really enjoyed the discussion. So let's give them another round of applause. We have some great future events happening here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, so please go on our website, bipartisanpolicy.org, to register for them. So have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, Dennis.